Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday can shatter everything you believe about the world around you. Emily Rodriguez thought she knew her life. Predictable, safe, unremarkable. She thought she knew the people in it too. The respected boss who mentored her, the quiet delivery boy who barely spoke, the small law office where nothing exciting ever happened. But in the span of a single afternoon, Emily would discover that the person she trusted most was her greatest threat, and the person she noticed least would become her unexpected savior. This is the story of how one woman found her courage in the most unlikely place.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Emily Rodriguez adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the antique clock on the mahogany reception desk. 4:47 p.m. 13 more minutes until she could lock up Hayes & Associates and head home to her small apartment, where leftover Chinese takeout and a Netflix series waited for her. The law office had been unusually quiet today, with Mr. Hayes spending most of his time behind closed doors, taking hushed phone calls that seemed to agitate him more with each passing hour. The brass nameplate on her desk read, Emily Rodriguez, receptionist, though after 3 years at the firm, she handled far more than greeting clients and answering phones. She managed case files, scheduled depositions, handled billing, and kept the small 2-story building running smoothly. Mr. Richard Hayes, the senior partner and sole attorney at the firm, often told her she was indispensable, though the compliment never came with a raise to match her expanded responsibilities. Emily had always been content with her role in the background. She wasn't ambitious like her college friends who moved to big cities and climbed corporate ladders. She preferred the quiet predictability of Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone and nothing dramatic ever happened. At 26, she had settled into a comfortable routine that felt safe, if not particularly exciting. The front door chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Jake Thompson entered carrying his usual thermal delivery bag, looking slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs to the second-floor office. At 19, Jake had the eager energy of someone still figuring out their place in the world. He worked for 3 different delivery services and seemed to be constantly on the move, earning enough to support his studies at the community college. Emily barely looked up from her computer screen as Jake approached the desk. She had always been polite to him, of course, but she'd never really seen him as anything more than part of the office routine, like the coffee machine or the afternoon mail delivery. He was just the quiet kid who brought lunch orders and rarely spoke beyond asking for signatures on receipts. Jake cleared his throat softly. Emily glanced up, noting his slightly nervous expression. He was average height with dark hair that always looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and brown eyes that seemed to take in more than he let on. Today, something in his demeanor struck her as different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. Mr. Hayes emerged from his office, straightening his expensive tie. At 52, Richard Hayes commanded attention wherever he went. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, he wore his success like armor. His suits were perfectly tailored, his handshake firm, his voice authoritative. Emily had always admired his confidence and legal expertise. He'd taken a chance on hiring her straight out of community college, and she felt genuinely grateful for the opportunity. Jake handed over the paper bag containing Mr. Hayes' usual Tuesday order, a club sandwich and black coffee from Moretti's Deli. Mr. Hayes barely acknowledged the young man, his attention already shifting to his phone as it buzzed with another call. He retreated to his office, closing the door firmly behind him. Emily processed Jake's payment, their interaction as routine as always. But as Jake turned to leave, he hesitated, glancing back at the closed office door where Mr. Hayes' muffled voice could be heard through the thick wood. Jake's expression seemed troubled, almost concerned, which struck Emily as odd. Why would a delivery driver care about her boss's phone calls? After Jake left, Emily tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over her. She returned to organizing files, losing herself in the familiar task of alphabetizing and cross-referencing case documents. The work was methodical and soothing, requiring just enough attention to keep her mind occupied without being challenging. At exactly 5 p.m., Mr. Hayes emerged from his office again, this time carrying his briefcase and looking haggard. The confident demeanor he'd worn earlier had shifted to something Emily had never seen before: anxiety, maybe even fear. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect appearance seemed somehow diminished. Emily gathered her purse and prepared to leave when Mr. Hayes stopped beside her desk.
His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made her stomach tighten with unease. The office felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made Emily's skin prickle with awareness. Outside, the autumn sun was setting earlier each day, casting long shadows through the tall windows. The familiar space suddenly felt less comfortable, less safe than it had just moments before. What Emily would discover in the next few minutes would forever change not just her opinion of Mr. Hayes, but her understanding of her own strength. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets.
Mr. Hayes looked directly at Emily, his gaze intense and calculating. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her pulse quicken with apprehension. "Emily, I need you to do something for me before you leave. There are some old case files in the basement storage room that I need retrieved. Specifically, the Patterson custody case from 2019 and the Morrison personal injury settlement from 2020. They should be in the archived boxes." Emily nodded, though something about the request felt unusual. Mr. Hayes rarely asked her to venture into the basement, preferring to handle archived materials himself. The basement of the converted Victorian house that served as their office was cramped and poorly lit, filled with decades of legal documents stored in bankers' boxes. It wasn't a place she enjoyed spending time. But the request seemed straightforward enough. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. Should I bring them up to your office?" "No. Just look through them first. Make sure all the documentation is complete. I'll wait here until you're finished." There was something in his tone that made Emily pause, a careful control that seemed forced, as if he were working hard to appear casual. But she dismissed her concerns as overthinking and gathered her keys to unlock the basement door. The basement stairs creaked under her feet as she descended into the musty darkness. She fumbled for the light switch, and a single bare bulb illuminated the cramped space. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, packed with boxes labeled by year and case type. The air smelled of old paper and dampness, with an underlying mustiness that always made her want to finish quickly and return to the fresh air upstairs. Emily located the boxes Mr. Hayes had mentioned, pulling them from their shelves and setting them on the small table they kept down there for reviewing archived materials. The Patterson box was thick with documents: custody agreements, psychological evaluations, financial statements, and correspondence between attorneys. She began to flip through the files methodically, checking that everything was properly organized and accounted for. It was in the Morrison box that she found something that made her blood run cold. Tucked behind the official settlement documents was a folder she almost missed, a thin manila envelope labeled "Private Correspondence" in Mr. Hayes' handwriting. Inside were photocopies of emails between Mr. Hayes and someone at Morrison's insurance company, along with handwritten notes in the margins that made her hands tremble as she read them. The emails detailed a plan to deliberately withhold evidence that would have significantly increased Morrison's settlement, evidence that Mr. Hayes had discovered but chose not to present to the court. The insurance company had paid Mr. Hayes a substantial sum to keep the information buried, while Morrison received only a fraction of what he was entitled to after suffering permanent disability in a workplace accident. Emily's mind raced as she processed what she was reading. This wasn't just legal malpractice, it was fraud. Mr. Hayes had betrayed his client's trust and manipulated the legal system for personal gain. Morrison had struggled financially for years after his accident, forced to sell his home and move in with relatives because the settlement barely covered his medical bills, while Mr. Hayes had purchased a new luxury car and taken expensive vacations. Her hands shaking, Emily continued searching through the documents. What she found next was even more damning. Hidden in various case files were records of similar schemes dating back nearly 5 years. Client after client had been cheated out of rightful settlements, while Mr. Hayes lined his pockets with payoffs from insurance companies and opposing counsel. The Patterson custody case revealed another horrifying truth. Mr. Hayes had been paid by Patterson's ex-husband
to throw the case, allowing an abusive man to gain custody of children who would have been safer with their mother. Emily remembered Mrs. Patterson's tears when she lost custody, remembered how the woman had blamed herself for not being a good enough advocate for her children. Emily felt nauseated as the full scope of Mr. Hayes's corruption became clear. This wasn't just money. Lives had been destroyed. Children had been placed in danger. Families had been torn apart, all while the man she'd respected and admired presented himself as a pillar of the legal community. She photographed the most damaging documents with her phone, her training in office management making her instinctively document evidence even as her emotional mind reeled from the discoveries. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady, but she managed to capture clear images of the most incriminating materials. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs made her freeze. Mr. Hayes was coming down, his expensive shoes clicking against the wooden steps. In the harsh light of the single bulb, his face looked different, harder, more calculating. The kind smile and gentle demeanor he'd always shown her seemed to have vanished completely. "Finding everything you need, Emily?" His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Emily realized with growing terror that somehow he knew that she'd seen the documents she wasn't supposed to see. "Yes, sir. Just finishing up the Morrison file review." Emily's voice sounded strange to her own ears, higher-pitched and strained despite her efforts to appear calm. Mr. Hayes closed the box and began moving toward the stairs. But Mr. Hayes didn't step aside to let her pass. "You know, Emily, you've been such a valuable employee over the years. Reliable, discreet, trustworthy. Those are rare qualities." The way he emphasized discreet sent chills down her spine. Mr. Hayes stepped closer, effectively blocking her path to the stairs. The basement suddenly felt much smaller, more claustrophobic. Emily realized she was trapped. "I've always appreciated your loyalty, and I'm sure that loyalty will continue, won't it? Sometimes in business there are complicated situations that require absolute discretion from the people we trust most." Emily's mouth drew dry. This was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Mr. Hayes was telling her to keep quiet about what she'd discovered, and the implicit consequence for refusing was clear in his cold stare. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Hayes." Emily tried to keep her voice steady, but she could hear the fear creeping in. Mr. Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only calculation and menace. "I think you understand perfectly, Emily. You're a smart girl, smart enough to know that loyalty is rewarded and disloyalty has consequences."
Emily was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who've been studying you all along, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source. Mr. Hayes moved even closer, close enough that Emily could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic scent of fear-induced sweat. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the confined space of the basement, every word felt like a physical blow. "You see, Emily, I know things about you that you might have forgotten you shared, like how you're the sole support for your sick mother in Phoenix, how you send her $500 every month for her medications, how you've been turned down for credit 3 times in the past year because your debt-to-income ratio is too high." Emily's blood turned to ice. She had confided in Mr. Hayes about her mother's condition during her first year at the firm, back when she'd thought he was a caring mentor who took genuine interest in his employees' well-being. She'd never imagined he was cataloging her vulnerabilities for potential future use. "If someone were to question your competence or honesty as an employee," he continued with terrifying calm, "if they were to suggest that you'd been stealing from client accounts or falsifying documents, well, who would believe a receptionist over a respected attorney? Your mother's medical care would become much more difficult to afford when you're unemployable and potentially facing criminal charges. The threat hit Emily like a physical blow. Not only was he threatening her own livelihood, but her mother's life. Without Emily's financial support, her mother wouldn't be able to afford the treatments that were keeping her stable. Mr. Hayes had weaponized Emily's love and sense of responsibility. "I would never steal," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Of course you wouldn't, but false accusations can be very convincing when they come from someone with my reputation. Bank records can be misinterpreted. Digital records can be corrupted. You'd be surprised how easy it is to create a compelling narrative of employee theft, especially when the employee had access to all the accounts and passwords." Emily realized with growing horror that Mr. Hayes had been planning this for some time. He'd given her administrative access to everything precisely so she could be framed if necessary. Her dedication and trustworthiness, qualities she'd always prided herself on, had been turned into weapons against her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Nothing more than what you've always given me, your loyalty and discretion. You've seen some documents tonight that, taken out of context, might appear problematic, but you're smart enough to understand that legal work is complex and things aren't always what they seem to someone without proper training." Mr. Hayes reached past her to straighten some papers on the table, a casual gesture that brought him close enough to whisper directly in her ear. "You're going to forget what you think you saw tonight. You're going to continue being the excellent employee you've always been, and in return, your job remains secure, your mother continues to receive her medication, and everyone stays happy. It's really quite simple." Emily nodded mechanically, her survival instincts overriding her moral outrage. She understood that she was completely at her mercy. He'd planned this scenario carefully, making sure she was isolated, vulnerable, and dependent on his goodwill. "I'm glad we understand each other," Mr. Hayes said, stepping back with a satisfied smile. "Now let's go upstairs and pretend this conversation never happened." As Emily climbed the basement stairs on unsteady legs, her mind was racing despite her outward compliance. Mr. Hayes walked behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a predator herding prey. The familiar office upstairs now felt like enemy territory, every corner potentially hiding another threat. The front door chimed just as they reached the main floor, and Emily's heart nearly stopped when she saw Jake Thompson standing there, looking confused and slightly concerned. He was holding his delivery bag and wearing an expression that suggested he'd forgotten something and returned to retrieve it. "Oh, sorry," Jake said, glancing between Emily and Mr. Hayes. "I think I left my phone charger here earlier." Emily's mind went completely blank. Jake's presence felt surreal after the nightmare she'd just experienced in the basement. Mr. Hayes immediately shifted back into his public persona, the threatening predator disappearing behind a mask of professional courtesy. "Of course, Jake. Feel free to look around." But Emily could see the tension in Mr. Hayes' jaw, the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides. Jake's unexpected return had clearly disrupted whatever plans he'd had for ensuring Emily's continued silence. Jake moved toward the reception area where he'd stood earlier, but his eyes kept darting to Emily's face. She realized she must look as shaken as she felt, pale, frightened, barely holding herself together. Jake's expression grew increasingly concerned as he took in her appearance. "Are you okay, Emily?" Jake asked directly, ignoring Mr. Hayes entirely. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The question was simple, but loaded with genuine concern that Emily hadn't expected. In the 3 years Jake had been delivering to the office, she'd never heard him speak with such directness or authority. Something in his tone made him look at him more carefully than she'd ever had before. Mr. Hayes immediately intervened, his voice smooth, but carrying an undertone of warning. "Emily is just tired. It's been a long day, haven't it, Emily?" The emphasis on her name was a reminder of their understanding, a subtle threat wrapped in apparent concern. Emily nodded mechanically, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. But Jake didn't seem satisfied with the explanation. His eyes moved from Emily to Mr. Hayes and back again, and Emily got the distinct impression that he was reading the dynamics in the room far more accurately than his 19 years and delivery job would suggest.
Mr. Hayes, didn't you usually leave around 4:30 on Tuesdays? I remember because you're never here when I make the late afternoon deliveries to other offices in the building. The observation was casual, almost innocent, but Emily caught the sharp look that flashed across Mr. Hayes's face. Jake was noting inconsistencies, asking questions that suggested he paid more attention to patterns than anyone realized. I had some extra work to catch up on today, Mr. Hayes replied, but his smooth confidence was beginning to show cracks. Jake nodded slowly and then did something unexpected. He walked directly to Emily's desk and began looking around the reception area more thoroughly than necessary for someone simply retrieving a phone charger. You know, I've been delivering to this office for almost 2 years now, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. Comes with the job. You learn to tell when someone's having a bad day, when they're stressed, when something's wrong. He found his charger near the coffee machine and pocketed it, but made no move to leave. Instead, he turned back to Emily with an expression of genuine concern that felt like a lifeline in her desperation. "Emily, are you sure you're all right? You look really shaken up." Mr. Hayes stepped forward, clearly intending to end the conversation, but Jake held up his hand in a gesture that was surprisingly authoritative for someone so young. "Actually, Mr. Hayes, could I speak with Emily privately for just a moment? I think she might need some fresh air." The request was polite but firm, and Emily realized that Jake somehow understood the situation was more serious than it appeared. Mr. Hayes's face darkened with barely controlled anger. "That won't be necessary. Emily was just about to head home." But Jake had positioned himself between Emily and Mr. Hayes, creating a physical barrier that felt both protective and intentional. Emily found herself wondering how a 19-year-old delivery driver had developed such confident instincts for reading dangerous situations. Emily was about to discover that the quiet delivery boy she'd barely noticed possessed secrets that could either save her life or destroy it. Sometimes the most ordinary people are hiding extraordinary truths.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The tension in the office had become palpable, with Jake and Mr. Hayes locked in a subtle standoff that Emily didn't fully understand. Jake's entire demeanor had shifted from the quiet, deferential delivery driver she knew to someone who seemed to possess an authority and awareness that defied his apparent age and occupation. "Mr. Hayes," Jake said with a politeness that didn't quite mask the steel in his voice, "I'm sure you understand that when someone looks as distressed as Emily does right now, a friend might be concerned for their well-being." The word friend hit Emily with unexpected force. In 3 years of polite interactions, she'd never considered Jake a friend. But the way he was positioning himself between her and Mr. Hayes, the careful way he was speaking, suggested he'd been paying far more attention to her than she'd ever realized. Mr. Hayes' facade of professional courtesy was rapidly cracking. "Jake, I appreciate your concern, but this is really none of your business. Emily is my employee and employees have rights," Jake interrupted smoothly, "including the right to seek help if they feel threatened or unsafe in their workplace." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Emily's mind reeled as she processed what was happening. How did Jake know she felt threatened? What had he seen or heard that made him understand the situation so clearly? Mr. Hayes' face flushed red with anger and what Emily now recognized as fear. Jake's unexpected intervention was clearly not part of whatever plan he'd had for ensuring Emily's silence. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Mr. Hayes said through gritted teeth. "Emily and I were simply discussing some confidential work matters. Nothing that concerns." Confidential work matters that left her looking terrified? Jake's voice was calm, but he could hear an undercurrent of something harder. "In my experience, legitimate business discussions don't usually leave employees looking like they've been threatened." Emily felt like she was watching a chess match she didn't understand. Jake was maneuvering Mr. Hayes with a skill that seemed impossible for someone his age. More importantly, he was creating space for her to think, to breathe, to consider options she hadn't known she had. Mr. Hayes' facade of professional courtesy was rapidly cracking. "Jake, I appreciate your concern, but this is really none of your business."
Emily is my employee, and employees have rights, Jake interrupted smoothly, including the right to seek help if they feel threatened or unsafe in their workplace. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Emily's mind reeled as she processed what was happening. How did Jake know she felt threatened? What had he seen or heard that made him understand the situation so clearly? Mr. Hayes' face flushed red with anger and what Emily now recognized as fear. Jake's unexpected intervention was clearly not part of whatever plan he'd had for ensuring Emily's silence. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Mr. Hayes said through gritted teeth. "Emily and I were simply discussing some confidential work matters. Nothing that concerns—" "Confidential work matters that left her looking terrified?" Jake's voice was calm, but he could hear an undercurrent of something harder. "In my experience, legitimate business discussions don't usually leave employees looking like they've been threatened." Emily felt like she was watching a chess match she didn't understand. Jake was maneuvering Mr. Hayes with a skill that seemed impossible for someone his age. More importantly, he was creating space for her to think, to breathe, to consider options she hadn't known she had. Mr. Hayes took a step toward Jake, his tall frame attempting to intimidate, but Jake didn't back down. If anything, he seemed to grow more confident, more assured as the confrontation escalated. "Young man, you're interfering in matters you don't understand." "Actually, I understand more than you think." What he pulled out of his delivery bag wasn't food or delivery receipts. It was a small digital recording device, and Emily's world tilted as she realized the implications. "You see, Mr. Hayes, I've been documenting some interesting patterns in this building for the past several months. Unusual meeting times, suspicious visitors, and today I heard raised voices coming from the basement area when I was making deliveries to the accounting office next door." Mr. Hayes went completely white. "You were eavesdropping?" "I was doing my job," Jake replied evenly, "but sound carries in old buildings, especially when someone is making threats about ruining careers and framing employees for theft." Emily's legs nearly gave out as she realized what Jake was saying. He'd heard the conversation in the basement. He'd recorded it. The threat that had seemed so absolute, so inescapable, suddenly had a witness. But Jake wasn't finished. He set the recording device on Emily's desk and pulled out his phone, bringing up what appeared to be a text message conversation. "I have also been in contact with several former clients of this firm who have had concerns about their representation. People talk, Mr. Hayes, especially when they feel they've been cheated." The phone screen showed a long thread of messages with someone named Morrison, work injury case. Emily's mind connected the dots. Jake had somehow made contact with the very people Mr. Hayes had defrauded. Mr. Hayes was now visibly shaking with rage and fear. "This is extortion. I'll have you arrested." "For what?" "Helping citizens who believe they've been victims of legal malpractice connect with each other. For documenting conversations that took place in public areas of a building. I think that you'll find that whistleblower protections are quite robust in cases involving attorney misconduct." Emily stared at Jake as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the quiet, unremarkable delivery driver she'd known. This was someone who understood legal terminology, who had been conducting what amounted to an investigation, who possessed recording equipment and the knowledge of how to use it effectively. "Who are you?" she whispered. Jake turned to her with a gentle smile that was completely at odds with the steel he had been showing Mr. Hayes. "My name really is Jake Thompson. I really am 19 years old, and I really do work for 3 different delivery services. But my father is Marcus Thompson, and he runs a private investigation firm that specializes in legal malpractice and insurance fraud." The revelation hit Emily like a thunderbolt. Marcus Thompson was a name she recognized from newspaper articles about high-profile corruption cases. His firm had exposed several major insurance scams and brought down corrupt attorneys across 3 states. "I've been working undercover for the past 6 months, building a case against Hayes & Associates based on complaints from former clients. What I didn't expect was to witness a direct threat against an employee tonight." Mr. Hayes made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a whimper. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, and he could see him calculating his options with increasing desperation. "This is entrapment. Nothing you have done will hold up in court." Jake shook his head with the confidence of someone who'd clearly thought through all the legal angles.
Actually, everything I've done has been conducted within full legal parameters. I'm a private citizen who witnessed suspicious activity and documented it appropriately. The recording was made in a semi-public space where you had no reasonable expectation of privacy. And Emily, as the threatened party, has every right to seek help and protection. Emily's mind was spinning as she tried to process this new reality. Jake, who she'd barely noticed, who she'd dismissed as unimportant, had been working to protect people like her all along. He'd been watching, documenting, building a case that could bring Mr. Hayes to justice. But even as relief flooded through her, she realized the danger wasn't over. Mr. Hayes was cornered now, and cornered predators were often their most dangerous. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Hayes suddenly lunged toward his office, presumably going for his phone to call someone. Lawyers, maybe, or possibly contacts who could help him disappear before the full scope of his crimes came to light. Jake moved more fast than I would have thought possible, intercepting Mr. Hayes and physically blocking his path to the office. "I don't think so," Jake said firmly. "We're going to wait right here until the authorities arrive." "You called the police?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I called my father 20 minutes ago, right after I heard the conversation in the basement. He's coordinating with both local law enforcement and the state attorney's office. They should be here any minute." Emily sank into a desk chair, overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. In the span of less than an hour, her entire world had been destroyed and rebuilt. The man she trusted had revealed himself as a monster. The boy she'd barely noticed had revealed himself as her savior. But Jake's revelations were about to take an even more shocking turn. Sometimes the people trying to save you are hiding secrets that run deeper than you could ever imagine.
As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Emily found herself studying Jake's face with new eyes. The confident, authoritative person who had confronted Mr. Hayes seemed to coexist with the quiet, observant young man she'd known for 2 years. But there were details she'd missed before. The way he carried himself, with a subtle awareness of his surroundings, how his eyes constantly cataloged potential exits and threats, the professional quality of his recording equipment. "Jake," she said quietly, "how long have you really been watching this office?" Jake glanced at Mr. Hayes, who was sitting rigidly in one of the client chairs, clearly calculating whether he could make a run for it before the police arrived. Satisfied that the older man wasn't an immediate flight risk, Jake turned his full attention to Emily. "The investigation started 8 months ago when Morrison contacted my father's firm, but I didn't begin the undercover work until 6 months ago, and I didn't start delivering to this specific office until 3 months ago. So when we first met, I already knew who you were, yes. I knew you were Hayes' receptionist, that you handled most of his administrative work, that you had access to case files and financial records. I also knew you sent money to your mother in Phoenix and that you'd been working here for nearly 3 years. Emily felt a chill as she realized the implications. "You investigated me too." Jake's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Emily, in this type of investigation, we have to examine everyone with access to sensitive information. Initially, we had to consider the possibility that you might be complicit in Hayes' activities." The words hit her like a slap. For 3 months, while she'd been politely taking his delivery orders and barely acknowledging his existence, Jake had been evaluating whether she was a criminal. "But it became clear very quickly that you weren't involved. Your financial records showed no unexplained income. Your behavior patterns were consistent with someone who genuinely didn't know what was happening. And your interactions with clients showed real empathy and concern for their well-being." "You were watching my interactions with clients?" "I deliver food here at least 3 times a week, Emily. I see how you treat people, how you remember their names and ask about their families. I see how upset you get when clients are struggling financially or emotionally. Someone who was profiting from Hayes' fraud wouldn't react that way." Emily wasn't sure whether to feel violated or protected by this level of scrutiny. Jake had been studying her life in detail while she'd barely registered his existence. The asymmetry of their relationship felt overwhelming. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Something I need to tell you about why this case became so important to me personally." Mr. Hayes looked up sharply at this, his attention caught by the change in Jake's demeanor.
3 years ago, my uncle was injured in a construction accident. He hired Hayes and Associates to handle his workers' compensation claim. The case seemed straightforward. Clear employer negligence, solid medical documentation, witnesses to the accident. Emily's stomach began to sink as she anticipated where this story was going. My uncle should have received a settlement that would have covered his medical bills and provided some compensation for permanent disability. Instead, Hayes negotiated a minimal settlement and told my uncle it was the best he could do. My uncle trusted him. Jake's voice was steady, but Emily could see the pain in his eyes. 3 months later, my uncle died. Not from his injuries directly, but from complications that developed because he couldn't afford proper follow-up care. He'd been rationing his medications and skipping physical therapy sessions because the settlement barely covered his basic living expenses. Emily glanced at Mr. Hayes and saw something flicker across his face. Not remorse, but what looked like irritation at being reminded of an inconvenient consequence of his actions. It wasn't until after the funeral that my father started investigating Hayes and Associates. We discovered that Hayes had been paid by the construction company's insurance provider to minimize the settlement. My uncle was entitled to nearly 10 times what he received, but Hayes sold him out for a payoff that was probably less than the cost of his new car. The personal stakes of Jake's investigation suddenly made sense to Emily. This wasn't just about justice in the abstract. It was about avenging a family member who had been betrayed and essentially killed by Mr. Hayes' greed. "So when you started delivering here," Emily began, "I wanted to look Hayes in the eye every day and know that he had no idea who I was or what was coming for him," Jake said with quiet intensity. "I wanted to study him, understand how he operated, document everything so thoroughly that he'd have no possible escape when we finally moved against him." Emily realized that Jake's apparent youth and invisibility had been perfect camouflage for his real mission. Mr. Hayes would never suspect that the unremarkable delivery driver was actually an undercover investigator with deeply personal reasons for wanting to destroy him. "But something changed about 3 months ago," Jake said, looking directly at Emily. "I started to care about what happened to you specifically, not just as a potential witness or source of information." Emily's breath caught as she processed what he was saying. "I watched you work every day with such dedication and integrity. I saw how much you cared about doing the right thing, how hard you worked to support your mother, how kind you were to clients who were going through the worst times of their lives. Someone who was profiting from Hayes' fraud wouldn't react that way." The authorities chose that moment to arrive, with footsteps echoing up the staircase and official voices calling out identifications. But Emily barely heard them. She was staring at Jake, seeing him completely clearly for the first time. "You've been protecting me," she said softly. "I've been trying to. I knew Hayes would eventually realize that you had access to information that could destroy him. I knew he'd try to either buy your silence or eliminate you as a threat. I just didn't expect it to happen today." Marcus Thompson, Jake's father, entered the office first, followed by 2 detectives and a representative from the state attorney's office. Marcus was an older version of Jake. Same dark hair, same intelligent eyes, same aura of quiet competence. He quickly assessed the situation and began coordinating with the officials, while Jake provided a brief overview of the evening's events. Emily watched in fascination as Jake transformed again, this time into a professional witness giving detailed, precise testimony about what he'd observed and recorded. His recall was perfect, his presentation clear and compelling. This wasn't just a teenager who'd stumbled into a dangerous situation. This was someone who'd been trained in investigation and evidence gathering. Mr. Hayes was read his rights and taken into custody, with remarkably little drama. As he was being led away, he looked back at Emily with an expression of pure venom. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise of future retribution. But Jake stepped into Hayes' line of sight, blocking his view of Emily, and spoke with a calm certainty that was more intimidating than any threat. "Yes, it is."
In the weeks that followed Hayes' arrest, Emily's life underwent a complete transformation. The law office was closed pending the criminal investigation, leaving her temporarily unemployed, but strangely liberated. The weight of working for someone she'd unknowingly enabled was lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before.
Jake's father, Marcus Thompson, offered her a position with his investigative firm, recognizing her intimate knowledge of Hayes's operations and her natural attention to detail. But more importantly, Emily found herself drawn to the work of seeking justice for people who had been wronged by those impositions of power. The investigation into Hayes and Associates uncovered a web of corruption that stretched back nearly a decade. Emily's insider knowledge proved invaluable in helping prosecutors understand how Hayes had manipulated case files and hidden evidence from clients. Her testimony was crucial in securing convictions not just against Hayes, but against several insurance company executives who had participated in the fraud schemes. Morrison, the construction worker whose case Emily had discovered in the basement, was among 17 former clients who received substantial settlements when the full extent of Hayes's betrayal came to light. The Patterson custody case was reopened, and Mrs. Patterson was awarded full custody of her children after evidence emerged of her ex-husband's abuse, evidence that Hayes had been paid to suppress. But it was Emily's relationship with Jake that underwent the most profound transformation. The revelation of his true identity and the depth of his investigation had initially left her feeling manipulated and deceived. She struggled with the knowledge that someone she'd barely noticed had been studying her life in such detail while she remained completely unaware of his true nature. "I understand why you're angry," Jake said during one of their many conversations in the weeks following Hayes' arrest. They were sitting in a coffee shop near what used to be Emily's office, a neutral location where she felt safe processing her complex emotions about everything that had happened. "I'm not angry," Emily replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm confused. For 2 years, I thought I knew exactly who everyone around me was. My boss was a respected lawyer. You were just a delivery driver. I was just a receptionist living a quiet life. Now I find out that none of that was true." Jake stirred his coffee thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully. "You're right that I wasn't completely honest about who I was. But everything about how I saw you, how I came to care about you, that was completely real. How can you believe that when you were literally assigned to investigate me?" "Because the investigation ended within 2 weeks of meeting you," Jake said firmly. "I knew within days that you weren't involved in Hayes' crimes, but I kept coming to deliver food to that office long after I had enough evidence to close the case against Hayes, and it wasn't for professional reasons." He leaned forward, his brown eyes intense with sincerity. "Emily, I could have wrapped up this investigation months ago. I had enough evidence to arrest Hayes by Christmas, but I kept prolonging it because I didn't want to lose the excuse to see you 3 times a week." Emily felt her carefully maintained emotional barriers beginning to crack. "That's not fair, Jake. You knew everything about me while I knew nothing about you. That's not how real relationships start." "I agree," Jake agreed, "and if you can't get past that, I'll understand. But I want you to know that every conversation we had, every smile you gave me, every time you asked how my day was going, those moments mattered to me more than you realized. You were never just a target of investigation. You became the reason I wanted to make sure justice was done." Over the following months, Emily slowly came to understand the depth of Jake's feelings and the complexity of his situation. His work with his father's firm wasn't just a job, it was a calling born from personal tragedy and a desire to prevent others from suffering as his family had. His investigation of Hayes hadn't been cold and calculating, but driven by genuine concern for the victims. More importantly, Emily began to see how Jake's hidden identity reflected her own hidden strengths. Just as she had underestimated him, she had underestimated herself. The quiet receptionist who seemed unremarkable possessed courage, integrity, and intelligence that proved crucial in bringing a corrupt lawyer to justice. Working with the Thompson investigation firm revealed abilities Emily hadn't known she possessed. Her years of managing Hayes' office had given her an understanding of legal procedures and document management that proved invaluable in building cases against white-collar criminals. Her natural empathy and communication skills made her exceptionally effective at interviewing victims and witnesses who'd been traumatized by the very system meant to protect them. "You have a gift for making people feel safe enough to tell their stories," Marcus Thompson told her during her 6-month review. "That's not something you can teach, it's something you either have or you don't." Emily found deep satisfaction in work that felt meaningful in a way her previous job never had.
Instead of unknowingly enabling corruption, she was actively fighting it. Instead of being a passive observer of injustice, she was helping to remedy it. The transformation from victim to advocate felt like discovering her true purpose. Her relationship with Jake evolved slowly, built on mutual respect and shared experiences of overcoming deception and finding truth. She appreciated that Jake never rushed her or pressured her to trust him more quickly than felt comfortable. He understood that rebuilding trust after such a fundamental deception would take time and patience. 2 years after Hayes' arrest, Emily had become one of the most effective investigators at Thompson Investigations, specializing in cases involving legal malpractice and professional misconduct. She testified before state legislative committees about the need for a stronger oversight of attorneys, and her work had led to significant reforms in how client complaints were investigated and prosecuted.
The quiet receptionist, who had once felt invisible and unimportant, had found her voice as an advocate for justice. The woman, who had been terrified of confronting authority figures, now routinely testified against corrupt lawyers, dishonest insurance executives, and negligent professionals who betrayed their clients' trust. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had never found those documents in the basement," Emily mused to Jake one evening as they walked through the downtown area where Hayes & Associates had once operated. The building now housed a victims' rights organization that Emily had helped establish. "You would have found your courage some other way," Jake replied with certainty. "People like you don't stay silent forever when they see injustice. You might have taken a different path, but you would have ended up fighting for what's right." Emily smiled, appreciating Jake's faith in her character, but she also understood that some transformations require a catalyst, a moment of crisis that forces you to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed. "The person I was before that night feels like a stranger now," she admitted. "I can't imagine going back to being someone who just accepts that bad things happen and there's nothing you can do about them." "That person was never really you," Jake said gently. "That was just who you thought you had to be. The real Emily was always someone who cared deeply about justice and had the strength to fight for it. You just needed the right circumstances to discover that about yourself." As they walked past the building where Emily had once worked in quiet obscurity, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of herself and her capabilities had evolved. The experience with Hayes had been traumatic, but it had also been transformative in the most fundamental way possible. She had learned that the people you trust most can be the ones who pose the greatest danger. She had learned that the people you noticed least can be the ones most worthy of your attention. Most importantly, she had learned that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can discover reservoirs of courage and strength they never knew they possessed. Emily's story became one that she shared with other victims of professional misconduct, helping them understand that they too had the power to seek justice and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. Her transformation from passive victim to active advocate inspired others to find their own voices and fight their own battles against corruption and abuse of power. The woman who had once felt invisible and powerless had become someone whose very presence reminded others that justice was possible, that truth could prevail over deception, and that sometimes the most ordinary people could have the most extraordinary impact on the world around them. 3 years after the collapse of Hayes & Associates, Emily stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol, preparing to deliver testimony about proposed legislation to strengthen protections for whistleblowers in professional misconduct cases. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once been too intimidated to ask for a raise was now addressing state legislators about systemic reform. The audience included dozens of victims of professional misconduct, many of whom had found the courage to come forward after hearing Emily's story. She had become an inadvertent spokesperson for the power of ordinary people to challenge corrupt authority, though she still struggled with the public attention her transformation had generated. Jake sat in the front row, offering silent support as he had throughout her journey from victim to advocate. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than either had initially expected, built on the foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect that had emerged from their traumatic first encounter.
As Emily began her testimony, she reflected on how the frightened receptionist who had stumbled upon evidence of corruption in a basement had become someone who could command the attention of lawmakers and inspire others to action. 3 years ago, I discovered that the attorney I worked for had been systematically defrauding his clients for nearly a decade. I found evidence of insurance fraud, witness intimidation, and deliberate malpractice that had destroyed families and left vulnerable people without recourse. Emily went on to describe not just the crimes Hayes had committed, but the system that had enabled him to operate with impunity for so long. She spoke about the isolation victims felt when they suspected their attorneys were betraying them, the difficulty of proving misconduct without inside knowledge, and the economic pressures that made it nearly impossible for working-class clients to challenge powerful lawyers. The legislation before you today would create protection and support systems for employees who witness professional misconduct. It would establish clear reporting channels, provide economic security for whistleblowers who lose their jobs, and create accountability mechanisms that make it harder for corrupt professionals to continue victimizing vulnerable clients. During the question and answer session that followed, Emily fielded inquiries from legislators who were clearly impressed by her expertise and passion. Her years working with Thompson Investigations had given her comprehensive knowledge of white-collar crime and regulatory systems, transforming her from someone who processed legal paperwork to someone who understood the broader implications of professional misconduct. Representative Sarah Martinez, the bill's primary sponsor, asked about the personal cost of becoming a whistleblower. "I won't lie to you," Emily replied honestly. "Coming forward destroyed the life I thought I wanted and forced me to rebuild everything from scratch. I lost my job, my sense of security, and my trust in institutions I had always believed were protecting people like me." She paused, looking out at the audience filled with people who had faced similar crossroads in their own lives. But staying silent would have destroyed something more important: my ability to live with myself knowing I could have prevented other people from being victimized. The personal cost of speaking up was significant, but the cost of remaining complicit would have been devastating. After her testimony, Emily was approached by dozens of people who shared their own stories of witnessing misconduct and struggling with whether to come forward. Many mentioned that hearing about her experience had given them the courage to report wrongdoing in their own workplaces. A young woman named Maria, who worked as a paralegal, described discovering that her boss was billing clients for work that was never performed. An accountant named David explained how he'd uncovered evidence that his firm was helping clients evade taxes through illegal schemes. A nurse named Jennifer tearfully recounted watching doctors perform unnecessary procedures on elderly patients to maximize billing. Each conversation reinforced Emily's understanding of how widespread professional misconduct was and how many people suffered in silence because they didn't believe they had the power to challenge authority figures. "The hardest part," Maria confided, "is knowing that if I report this, I'll probably lose my job and maybe never work in law again. But if I don't report it, more clients will be cheated." Emily recognized the exact dilemma she had faced 3 years earlier. The paralegal was trapped between self-preservation and moral obligation, just as Emily had been in that basement when she first discovered Hayes' crimes. "Can I tell you something that took me a long time to understand? You're not responsible for the consequences of other people's criminal behavior. If reporting misconduct costs you your job, that's not your fault. It's the fault of the people who chose to commit crimes and the systems that failed to protect people who do the right thing." Over the following months, Emily remained in contact with many of the people who had approached her at the Capitol. She helped them connect with appropriate authorities, provided guidance on documenting evidence, and offered emotional support as they navigated the challenging process of reporting misconduct.
Maria eventually filed a complaint against her boss with the State Bar Association, leading to an investigation that uncovered widespread billing fraud affecting hundreds of clients. David worked with federal investigators to expose the tax evasion schemes, resulting in criminal charges against several partners at his firm. Geneser's reports led to a comprehensive review of the hospital's practices and ultimately prevented vulnerable patients from being subjected to unnecessary medical procedures. Each success reinforced Emily's belief that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to create change when they found the courage to use their voices. Jake, who had initially been drawn to investigative work by his desire for justice in his uncle's case, found his motivation evolving as he watched Emily's impact on other victims of misconduct. His work with Thompson Investigations increasingly focused on cases that involved whistleblowers and employee retaliation, using his skills to protect people who chose to speak out against corruption. "You've changed how I think about this work," Jake told Emily one evening as they reviewed case files in their shared apartment. They had moved in together the previous year, their relationship having grown into a partnership, both personal and professional. "How so?" "When I started investigating Hayes, I was focused on punishment, making him pay for what he did to my uncle and other victims. But watching you work with whistleblowers has shown me that the real power is in prevention. Every person you help find the courage to report misconduct potentially saves dozens or hundreds of future victims." Emily smiled, appreciating how Jake's perspective had evolved alongside her own. His initial desire for vengeance had transformed into a commitment to systemic change, just as her fear and victimization had evolved into advocacy and empowerment. Their work together had become a model for other investigative firms, demonstrating how combining traditional detective work with victim support and advocacy could create more comprehensive approaches to fighting professional misconduct. Marcus Thompson, Jake's father and the firm's founder, officially made Emily a partner in Thompson Investigations during their 4th year of operation. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by dozens of clients whose cases Emily had helped resolve and colleagues who had watched her transformation from traumatized victim to confident advocate. "Emily represents everything this firm stands for," Marcus said in his remarks. "She understands that seeking justice isn't just about punishment, it's about preventing future harm and empowering people to protect themselves and their communities." Emily's acceptance speech reflected on the journey that had brought her from a basement filled with evidence of corruption to a position where she could help others navigate similar discoveries. "4 years ago, I thought courage was something that other people possessed, heroes in movies or activists in history books. I never imagined that an ordinary receptionist could become someone who challenges powerful institutions and wins." She looked out at the audience, seeing faces of people whose lives had been changed by their willingness to speak truth to power. "But I've learned that heroism isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. It's about recognizing that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice, and deciding that you'd rather face the consequences of speaking up than live with the consequences of staying quiet." The firm's success in handling whistleblower cases attracted national attention, with Emily being invited to speak at conferences and contribute to policy discussions about professional misconduct and employee protection. Her story became a case study taught in business ethics courses and legal professional responsibility classes. But perhaps more importantly, Emily's example inspired countless individuals to recognize their own power to create change. The Thompson Investigations website featured a section called Emily's Network, a resource for people considering reporting misconduct, offering practical guidance, emotional support, and connections to appropriate authorities and advocacy organizations. The network grew to include thousands of people across the country who had found the courage to speak out against corruption in their own workplaces and communities. Teachers who reported administrative fraud, social workers who exposed abuse in care facilities, corporate employees who revealed environmental violations, all drawing inspiration from Emily's transformation from victim to advocate. 5 years after the Hayes case, Emily received a letter from Morrison, the construction worker whose case had first revealed the extent of Hayes's corruption. Morrison had used his settlement to establish a foundation providing financial assistance to workers injured on the job, ensuring they could afford proper medical care regardless of their legal settlements. "Your courage to speak up gave me back my life, but more than that, it gave me the chance to help other people avoid what I went through. That's a gift I can never fully repay." Emily kept the letter on her desk as a reminder of why her work mattered. The frightened woman, who had discovered corruption in a basement, had become someone whose actions created ripples of positive change that continue expanding years later. Her relationship with Jake had deepened into a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. They married in a small ceremony attended by clients who had become friends, colleagues who had become family, and Marcus Thompson, who had become a second father to Emily. I used to think that meeting you was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, but I've realized it wasn't luck. It was inevitable. People who care about justice the way we do were bound to find each other eventually. Emily's vows reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the work that continued to unite them. You saw something in me that I didn't know existed. You saw courage where I saw fear, strength where I saw weakness, and purpose where I saw confusion. Thank you for helping me become the person I was always meant to be. As Emily looked back on her transformation, she understood that the most profound changes in life often began with a single moment of moral clarity, a moment when you had to choose between safety and integrity, between comfort and courage. Her moment had come in a dusty basement, confronted with evidence of corruption that she could either ignore or act upon. The choice she made in that moment had not only changed her own life, but had created a cascade of change that continued to impact people she would never meet. The ordinary receptionist who had felt powerless and invisible had discovered that she possessed the power to challenge injustice and inspire others to do the same. Emily's story became a testament to the truth that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can discover within themselves the capacity for remarkable courage and create change that extends far beyond their own lives.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.